He followed the thunder and found a secret they tried to bury. It began with a missing child in the rain, a mother's scream, a trail of tiny footprints disappearing into the forest. They thought he was lost, but he wasn't. He had followed a sound, a cry not human, but desperate. At the bottom of a dry well, under lightning and panic, 2 dogs waited, one of them in labor, the other guarding her like a soldier. What that boy did next shouldn't have been possible, especially for a child who hadn't spoken in a year. This isn't a fairy tale. This is what happens when innocence meets instinct, and when love breaks every boundary ever built. The village of Arlen Ridge sat tucked into a crescent of pine-studded hills, half forgotten by maps and entirely abandoned by time. The kind of place where mail still came twice a week, and the only streetlight flickered like it had a secret. Scars from last year's wildfire still marked the tree lines like phantom hands, blackened trunks, scorched underbrush. But nature, in its quiet defiance, had begun reclaiming the land with soft green shoots and stubborn wildflowers. From the kitchen window, Lena watched the small boy crouched in the dirt, drawing circles with a stick. His name was Elliot, 5 years old, hair too long, and a silence too deep for his age. He hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Lena's fingers dipped absently into the sink of warm water, scrubbing a chipped plate, though her eyes never left the boy outside. The window pane was fogged at the corners from the morning's damp, but she could still make out the movements of his hands' slow, deliberate spirals in the soil. Not playing, not imagining, just moving. It was a ritual of his, these strange shapes in the dirt. Some days they looked like flowers. Other days they were just circles within circles, always quiet, always alone. Her chest ached as she wiped her hands dry on a towel, then rested them on the windowsill. "Time to come in soon," she murmured, though she didn't expect an answer. She rarely did anymore. The doctors had called it selective mutism, trauma-induced silence triggered by overwhelming grief. But labels didn't matter when your child no longer laughed at bedtime stories or cried when he scraped his knee. Elliot had been talkative once, curious, funny, always asking why the moon followed the car or why dogs tilted their heads when you spoke to them. But that was before the fire, before his father disappeared into the blaze to try and help a trapped neighbor, and never came back out, before the sirens and the smell of smoke seared themselves into Lena's lungs like a memory she could never exhale. Since then, Elliot hadn't said a word. Outside, clouds were beginning to roll over the ridge, gathering low and heavy. Their bellies hung gray with promise, muting the sunlight that had lingered all morning. Thunder cracked softly in the distance, like a throat clearing before a storm. The wind changed, too, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and something else Lena couldn't quite name. Not fear, but tension. A shift. She leaned out the window, brushing her hair back. "Elliot?" she called, loud enough to be heard, but soft enough not to startle. "It's going to rain, sweetie. Come in soon, okay?" The boy looked up. His brown eyes met hers, wide, solemn, as if the world weighed more on him than his small shoulders should bear. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But he held her gaze just long enough for her to believe he'd heard her. Then he turned back to his dirt patterns. Lena sighed. The garden still held the memory of spring-faded lavender stalks, the stubborn bloom of wild yarrow, but everything felt subdued now, like the village itself was holding its breath. Even the birds had quieted. Somewhere in the trees, a squirrel darted for cover, and the wind pushed low across the hills like a warning. Inside the kitchen, Lena rinsed the last of the dishes and placed them gently into the rack. The quiet around her was unnerving. not peaceful silence, but charged stillness. She'd learned to tell the difference since Elliot had gone mute. She moved toward the front door, intending to fetch her son and coax him inside before the weather broke, but something stopped her. A pause. It was subtle, the way you feel a cold breath before you see the window frost. She glanced back through the window. Elliot was gone. The stick lay where it had fallen, half buried in the soft dirt. Lena's heart seized. She pushed the door open so hard it slammed into the siding with a bang. "Elliot!" she called, louder now, eyes scanning the small patch of garden, the trail that wound around their house, the woods that loomed just beyond the back fence. "Elliot!" The wind picked up then, stronger now, threading through the trees like fingers through hair. Thunder cracked again closer. She ran outside barefoot, not caring about the chill of the grass or the gravel digging into her soles. Her gaze darted left, right, desperate. The yard was empty. And then her breath caught. At the far end of the garden, near the edge of the old tree line, the faintest trail of footprints marked the damp soil. Not adult-sized, smaller, child-sized, fresh. She didn't think. She just moved. "Elliot!" she shouted, her voice rising in a mixture of panic and pleading. No response. Only the wind in the trees. Only thunder, now louder, echoing off the hills. A sudden flash of lightning split the sky, so close and violent it turned the kitchen momentarily white. The windows rattled. A plate on the drying rack trembled. And in that single second of instinct, Lena turned her head back toward the garden. Elliot was gone. There was no cry, no sound, just absence. Her breath caught in her throat, jagged and raw. "Elliot?" she called, her voice sharp with confusion. She blinked hard, leaned out the door, scanned the path again. But the boy was not where she'd left him just moments ago. The garden was still too still. The little stick he'd been holding lay alone in the soil as if dropped mid-thought. Rain began to fall, light and sudden, soaking the ground in uneven polka dots. "Elliot!" she yelled now, louder. Fear seeping in, cracking through her voice. She ran down the porch steps barefoot, heart slamming in her chest like a warning bell. "Elliot! Answer me! Baby, please, where are you?" No reply. The garden stood hollow, haunted. Her eyes darted wildly around the yard, behind the trees, the shed, the compost bin. She ran toward the spot he'd been, calling again and again. The silence that met her wasn't just empty. It was indifferent, like the world had closed over where he'd been and forgotten. She dropped to her knees by the patch of disturbed soil, her hands trembling. The rain was picking up, steady now. Her fingers brushed against something, a faint impression in the grass, a small footprint partially obscured by droplets. She froze. Then another one. Slightly ahead, pressed into the soft earth. And another, leading toward the back edge of the property. Her throat tightened. "No. No. No, no," she whispered. The woods loomed just beyond the yard, dense, dark, stretching for miles into the mountain's flank. Elliot had always been afraid of them. He'd never gone near without clinging to her hand. Until now. Lena rose, knees muddy, breath shallow. For a moment she hesitated at the edge, staring into the shadowed canopy, the tangle of underbrush, the dripping pine boughs shivering in the wind. Every instinct screamed to call for help, to wait, to think, but there was no time. She plunged in. Branches slapped her arms. The air turned colder, the ground uneven beneath her bare feet. "Elliot!" she shouted, her voice ragged now. "Baby, please, just say something!" Nothing. Only the sound of the storm building in the sky and her own breath loud in her ears. She followed the footprints, faint and broken, smeared by the rain. They wound through brush, around trees, deeper into the woods than any child should have dared. Lena's mind raced. Why would he come here? What had drawn him? A memory surfaced. Elliot once whispering, long ago, that he thought the forest breathed at night, that it watched, that it called. She shook the thought away. Lightning flashed again, closer. Thunder boomed behind it, shaking the ground like the forest had its own heartbeat. The trail dipped into a shallow ravine, slick with runoff. She stumbled, caught herself on a root, and kept going. Each step deeper into the forest felt like a choice she couldn't undo. "Please, baby," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, let me find you." Rain soaked her shirt, plastered her hair to her face. Her fingers were scraped raw, but she didn't stop. Then, in the near-distance movement, she pushed through a curtain of brambles and saw him, lying flat on his stomach at the edge of an old overgrown stone well. Elliot's small arms reached down into the darkness below. He didn't look up, didn't react to the thunder. He was frozen, consumed by something unseen. Lena's breath caught in her chest, both from relief and terror. "Elliot!" she cried, stumbling toward him. "Sweetheart, don't move!" But when she reached him, when she looked over the edge into that black mouth of forgotten stone, she heard it, whimpering, desperate, alive, not human. Lena dropped to her knees beside her son, her hand gripping his back. And from the shadows below, two pairs of eyes stared up. The deeper Lena moved into the forest, the more the world behind her ceased to exist. The path had long since vanished, swallowed by moss and shadow. Now all she had were instinct, broken twigs, and the fragile trail of small footprints pressed into the forest floor, each one barely visible beneath the curtain of rain. "Just keep going," she whispered to herself, pushing aside a dripping branch. Her arms were scratched, her breath ragged. Thunder cracked again somewhere to the west. But closer this time, like the sky itself was following her. The underbrush thinned slightly, and she paused, scanning the trees ahead. And then she saw it. Not a structure, not a cabin, a clearing. Wild grass and stones, circled by gnarled oaks that arched above like old sentinels. In the middle, half swallowed by ivy and thyme, was a crumbling well, its stone rim chipped and slick with moss. Rainwater had gathered around its base in shallow pools, and something about it felt ancient, forgotten. And there, flat on his stomach in the mud, was Elliot. Lena's heart stopped. He didn't turn, didn't flinch, just lay there, arms stretched over the lip of the well, his fingers straining into the darkness below. She rushed toward him, slipping once in the wet grass. "Elliot!" No response. As she knelt beside him, she finally saw his face, pale, soaked, and streaked with tears. His eyes were locked downward, unblinking, filled with a kind of silent desperation that made her stomach twist. And then Lena heard it too, a sound from below, not echo, not wind, whimpering, soft, broken, almost human in its pain, but not quite. A cry that rose from the belly of the well like a secret no one was meant to hear. Lena leaned over the edge, and what she saw knocked the breath from her chest. 2 German shepherds were trapped in the narrow shaft, perhaps 15 feet down. One stood on trembling legs pressed against the stone wall, staring up with wide, frantic eyes. The other lay partially on her side, body heaving in shallow bursts, her legs shaking. Lena's mind scrambled to catch up. Both dogs were pregnant, their bellies full, their ribs visible, their fur caked in grime. And the one on the ground, Lena could see it now, was in the throes of labor. The spasms, the strained breaths, the blood trailing beneath her. "Oh, my God," Lena murmured. Elliot shifted beside her. His hand touched her sleeve and gripped it hard. He didn't speak, his voice still lost to the year-long silence, but his eyes pleaded with her. "Help them." She knelt and cupped his cheeks gently, trying to catch his gaze. "How did you find them?" she whispered, half to him, half to herself. He didn't answer. He only pointed again into the well. The wind tore through the clearing then, cold and insistent, tugging at Lena's soaked shirt. The trees creaked above them. The storm was nearly overhead. Lena's heart pounded, not from the thunder, but from the weight of what she saw. 2 dogs, both near death, one already giving birth. No phone, no rope, no help. Just her, and her son, and the echoing cries from a well no one had looked at in decades. The dog standing guard below let out a low, guttural sound. Not a bark, not a growl. Something between warning and plea. Its ears twitched toward Elliot, and for a second it almost looked like it recognized him. Or maybe just trusted him in a way it didn't trust the world anymore. Lena exhaled shakily. She couldn't explain it. But something about this wasn't random. This wasn't just 2 dogs falling into a hole. This was a secret that didn't want to stay buried. The laboring dog let out a cry, sharp and short, that cut through the wind like glass. Elliot flinched, and before Lena could stop him, he leaned forward again, stretching his hand as far as he could. The well was too deep, the walls too slick. If one of them slipped in, no, she wouldn't let that happen. "We're going to get them out," she said firmly, almost to convince herself. "We're going to get them both out." Elliot finally looked at her, and though he didn't say a word, his lips parted ever so slightly, his chin trembling as his tiny hand reached up and took hers. She squeezed it. Somewhere between the thunder and the whimpers, Lena felt it deep in her bones. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a beginning. Rain fell harder now, slicing through the treetops and splattering against mossy stone. The forest around the clearing had grown darker, denser, as if nature itself was closing in around them, holding its breath. Thunder grumbled above, low and drawn out, the kind that you feel in your ribs before you hear it in your ears. Lena gripped the rim of the old well, knuckles white, and peered once more into its depths. What she saw made her heart twist. One of the German shepherds, thin, soaked but alert, stood tall, her body hunched protectively over the second. Her eyes never left Lena's, as if weighing her soul. The other dog was crumpled on the damp floor of the well, curled slightly on her side, belly taut and twitching with contractions. She was shivering. Occasionally her front leg would flinch upward, paw curling in silent protest. Her breathing came in uneven bursts. A thin stream of blood trickled beneath her, dark against the stone. "Mama," Elliot whispered behind her, tugging gently at her sleeve. She turned. He didn't speak. But his fingers moved fast and desperate, signing in the way he had once learned when he was too shy to talk. Words Lena hadn't seen in over a year. Help. Them. Tears stung her eyes. She cupped his face, nodded once, then looked around frantically. No phone, she hadn't brought it out. No rope. no neighbors for miles. And now the storm had swallowed any signal, even if she'd had one. All they had was what they'd carried on them, which, at this moment, amounted to a rain-soaked jacket, a child's scarf, and the determination of a terrified mother whose son had just come back to life. Lena stood, brushing the wet hair from her face, trying to think. The lip of the well was too narrow to climb down into without risking a fall. The walls were slick with algae, and even if she could make it halfway, she'd never get back up, not with a full-grown dog in labor. But the standing dog, she was responding. When Lena leaned closer and softly said, "We're going to help," the dog tilted her head, ears flattening, but she didn't growl. She didn't retreat. She stayed, watching, still guarding, still believing in something. Lena turned to Elliot. "We need rope, or something like it." He blinked, thinking hard. Then without a word he pulled off his rain jacket. It was small, lightweight, but strong and waterproof. Next came his sweater. He handed them to her with trembling hands. Lena hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Her son wasn't just witnessing a rescue, he was leading it. And for the first time in a long time, his eyes were not vacant. They burned with purpose. She stripped off her own jacket, tied the sleeves to Elliot's, then began searching the tree line for vines, the thick, dry kind that still wrapped around the trunks like forgotten ropes. She found several damp but intact and began yanking them free, her fingers slipping as bark tore at her knuckles. The storm didn't care. The forest didn't care. But the dogs in the well? They did. Lena returned to the edge, her makeshift lifeline coiled in her arms. She looped the sleeves through the vines, knotting them tight, then glanced back down. The second dog had shifted her body, now trembling more violently, her eyes half-lidded. The contractions were coming closer together. If they didn't act fast. The standing dog, now clearly the companion, not the one in labor, seemed to understand. She gently nudged her friend's side, then looked up at Lena again. The look said everything. "She's ready. Tell us what to do." Lena lowered the knotted rope slowly, praying each makeshift knot would hold. Rain made the vines slick and heavy, and the well's depth pulled at her arms like gravity had grown teeth. But finally, the line touched the floor. Elliot leaned over beside her, peering down. And then it happened. The standing dog moved, first stepping one paw onto the cradle of jacket and vine. She nosed at the laboring dog, encouraging, then waited. The second dog groaned, weak, but shifted with effort, her legs trembling as she tried to sit up. Lena could hardly breathe. Together with something between language and loyalty, the two dogs maneuvered so that the weaker one was supported half-draped across the cradle. The standing dog adjusted her body carefully, curling around her companion, nudging her into place. They were ready. Lena turned to Elliot. "On 3, okay? You help pull. Slow, careful." He nodded, already gripping the other end of the vine. 1, 2, 3, pull. The rope strained. The weight pulled hard, but they didn't stop. With each tug, the cradle rose inch by inch from the dark. Water poured off the vines. Lena's arms burned, her legs shook, but she held on. And below, 2 pairs of eyes watched with something too deep to be fear. Something that looked like hope. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm now. Less fury, more weight. The kind of rain that seeps into your bones. It pooled at their feet, soaked every stitch of clothing, and blurred the world into gray edges. But neither Lena nor Elliot noticed any more. They had work to do. Lena knelt beside the pile of damp vines and fabric, her fingers shaking as she looped one length around the sleeve of Elliot's rain jacket. Her hands were raw from pulling bark, her palms scraped. But it didn't matter. What mattered was what waited below. "Hold this tight," she said, passing Elliot one end of the vine. He obeyed without hesitation, clutching it with both hands, his cheeks streaked with mud and rain, his silent focus locked on the knot she tied. She glanced at him just briefly and felt something twist deep in her chest. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't curled into himself, frozen in silence like he'd been so many times this past year. He was present, determined. A flash of his old self shone in the set of his jaw, in the quiet steadiness of his hands. And then, more than that. He reached for another vine, examined it, and began tying his own knot, looping it exactly the way he'd seen her do. Lena blinked. "Wait, where did you learn?" But Elliot didn't look up. He just shrugged, tied again, and reinforced the joint with a pull that surprised her. Like he'd been watching all along. Like part of him had never stopped trying, even when words had. Lena's breath caught. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You're amazing. You know that?" He didn't answer, but the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth. They kept working side by side. Elliot handed her his jacket, a tough waterproof shell with a zipper half broken and sleeves patched at the elbow. Lena carefully looped the arms through two of the strongest vines, weaving them into a makeshift cradle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even safe, not by any sane standard, but it was something, a lifeline. She tugged the final knot, testing its weight. The whole thing creaked ominously, but held. The trees swayed above them, groaning under wind. Lightning flared again in the clouds, but no strike came. Just the constant thrum of falling water and the distant mutter of thunder. And below, two dogs waited. One standing guard, the other lying curled and still. Lena approached the well again, gripping the bundled cradle in both hands. "Lower it slow," she whispered. "Let them smell it. Let them know." Elliot nodded and took the other end, feet braced against wet stone, tiny fingers white from tension. Together, they lowered the jacket into the dark. Inch by inch. The rain made it harder, sliding through their hands, soaking the vines so they swayed and swung. But Lena held steady, murmuring softly, guiding it as best she could. At last, the cradle reached the bottom. The standing dog took a cautious step forward. The other, still breathing, still fighting, lifted her head slightly, eyes dull but watching. And then, the moment that made Lena hold her breath. The healthy dog bent down and nuzzled the jacket. She sniffed once, then twice, and slowly, carefully, she turned toward her laboring companion and nudged her gently, once, twice, urging her to move. Elliot leaned over beside Lena, barely breathing. The rain stopped mattering. The storm quieted into background noise. The entire world seemed to shrink into this single moment of fragile trust, played out between stone and silence. The pregnant dog whimpered. Then, with a trembling effort, she shifted, one paw onto the cradle, then another. The healthy dog moved beside her, steadying her, nudging her into place. It wasn't just loyalty. It was sisterhood. Survival, yes, but something more ancient. Something sacred. Lena wiped her wet face, unsure if it was rain or tears. She turned to Elliot. "Ready?" He nodded. Together they braced the rope. Together they began to pull. The makeshift cradle swayed gently at the bottom of the well, vines slick with rain and tension. Below, The pregnant German shepherd lay curled inside it, body trembling, flanks heaving. Her companion, the one still standing, had nestled close until the very last second, nuzzling her gently, offering what comfort she could in that damp, narrow shaft of stone and shadow. Now, both Lena and Elliot crouched at the rim, fingers clenched tight around the lifeline they'd woven from vines, cloth, and hope. Lena looked at her son. "You ready?" Elliot gave one short nod. They began to pull. The weight at first was almost unbearable. Wet vines cut into Lena's palms, and the cradle didn't rise. It barely shifted. But they didn't stop. They leaned back, braced their legs, and heaved as one. One pull, two, three. The cradle jerked upward, sluggish and uneven. From below came a sharp whimper, then silence. Lena's breath caught. Her eyes darted to the edge. The cradle tilted dangerously on one side, caught on a jagged stone in the wall. "No, no, no, come on," she muttered, adjusting the line. Elliot didn't speak. He dug his heels into the mud and pulled with every ounce of his tiny strength, face twisted with effort, teeth clenched, and finally, the cradle came free. It rose, inch by aching inch. The laboring dog remained motionless in the harness, trusting. Her eyes, glassy with pain, blinked slowly each time the cradle bumped the wall. She didn't thrash. She didn't bark. Somewhere deep in her something understood, that they were trying, that they weren't giving up. The higher she rose, the more the vines stretched and creaked. Water streamed off every knot. Lena's arms shook. Her breath came in ragged bursts, but she didn't let go. Not now. Not when life, real, breathing life, hung at the end of that line. "Almost there," she gasped. "Almost. Just a little." A final pull, then another. And with one last groaning surge, the cradle crested the rim of the well, and the dog was back on solid earth. Lena collapsed to her knees beside her, hands already working to free the knots around the jacket. Elliot knelt opposite her, eyes wide, chest heaving. The German shepherd didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she stretched her front paws forward, dragging herself free of the tangled fabric. A pained whine escaped her throat, but she didn't collapse again. Instead, she crawled forward until her muzzle touched Elliot's knee. He froze. She pressed her nose into the fabric of his jeans and for a second simply breathed him in. Lena saw it. Something old and beautiful, unspoken. A connection, raw and wordless. And then the dog curled on the wet ground, resting her head in the grass, flanks still pulsing from contractions. But safe, alive. The sound that broke the silence was quiet, a tail, thumping once against the ground. Lena swallowed a sob and reached to touch her shoulder gently. "You did good, girl. You're safe now." But it wasn't over. She turned back to the well. The second dog, the protector, was still down there, standing, watching, silent. Elliot moved to the edge. He knelt and looked down, his hands gripping the rim. The rain had begun to ease now, falling in softer sheets. The light was fading into dusk. Lena followed his gaze. The dog hadn't moved. She hadn't made a sound. Her ears were forward, eyes locked on them, waiting not for rescue, but for permission. "She doesn't want to leave her," Lena whispered. Elliot pointed to the ground beside them, the dog lying there. Then he pointed down the well, and then, finally, to the cradle. She understood. Lena leaned forward. "We'll bring her back, too," she said quietly. "But you have to trust us now." A pause. The dog below blinked once, and then wordlessly, almost regally, she stepped into the cradle, as if she had made a choice, not to escape, but to follow, to continue guarding what she loved. Lena turned to Elliot. "Let's bring her up." And together, hands raw and hearts full, they lowered the rope again into the dark one last time. The storm was no longer wild. It had settled into a steady, bone-deep drumbeat like the earth itself breathing through the trees. Raindrops hissed on leaves and stone, dripping from pine needles like falling glass. The forest had turned quieter now, as if it too sensed the weight of what was happening at the edge of the forgotten well. Lena's arms ached with every tug. Her fingers, raw from pulling and soaked to the knuckles, barely registered sensation anymore. Beside her, Elliot strained silently, his brow furrowed, jaw clenched. They moved together without needing to speak, as if the storm had forged an unspoken rhythm between them. Below, the second dog, the guardian, was halfway up. Her weight was heavier than her companion's, not in body, but in presence. Every inch she ascended brought a deeper pressure to Lena's chest. This one hadn't just survived, she had fought, protected, and stayed behind until she was certain the other dog was safe. Now finally it was her turn. Lena whispered encouragements through gritted teeth. "Almost there. Just a little more." The cradle creaked and swayed dangerously, but they were nearly at the top. And then, snap! A sound like bones breaking under ice. One of the vines gave out. The cradle twisted violently, swinging to the side. The dog slipped backward, her hind legs hanging loose. She let out a startled bark, but didn't cry out in fear. Only shock. Lena's breath caught. "No! No, no!" She lunged forward, both hands reaching instinctively over the rim to grab what she could vine, cloth, fur. She caught the cradle just as it tilted, but her weight-tipped forward momentum dragged her dangerously close to the edge. And in that split second, Elliot tried to save her. He grabbed the back of her jacket, pulling with all his might. But the slick mud betrayed him. His foot slipped on a rock, and before Lena could even register what was happening, her son was sliding. Straight toward the well. Time fractured. Her hand shot out and grabbed the hem of his shirt. It tore halfway, but held. He teetered over the edge, arms flailing, eyes wide. And then, "Mama, help her!" The words shattered through the air like thunder. Lena froze. Not at the danger. Not at the weight in her arms, but at the sound. Her son's voice, clear, desperate, alive. It was the first time in a year she had heard it. The first time sound had come from that small, brave mouth, and it wasn't a scream for himself. It wasn't fear. It was compassion. It was for the dog. Something inside Lena broke wide open. She pulled him back with everything she had, arms trembling, teeth clenched against the burning in her shoulders. He collapsed beside her, panting, but he didn't cry. He looked at her with fierce, urgent eyes. "Help her," he repeated, softer now. Lena nodded, barely able to speak through the lump in her throat. They grabbed the rope together again. The cradle was still swaying, but the dog hadn't panicked. She'd steadied herself with front paws hooked over the cradle's edge, eyes locked on Elliot as if she had heard him too. Heard something in his voice that made her hold on. Lena pulled. Elliot pulled. Knot by knot, inch by inch, the cradle rose again. The forest, impossibly, held still. When the dog finally reached the top, Lena grabbed under her shoulders and hauled her the rest of the way out. Mud and blood smeared her chest and her eyes fluttered from exhaustion. But she was whole. Safe. The moment her paws touched solid ground, she turned not toward Lena, but toward Elliot. She stepped forward, pressed her forehead gently to his, and stayed there. No bark, no growl, just the sound of their breaths sinking in the rain. Lena sat back on her heels, stunned. He had spoken. Her boy had returned, not for her, but because he'd seen something suffering and couldn't let it go unheard. She wiped the rain from her face, blinking fast, and reached to pull both of them into her arms. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, to the boy, to whatever had held them all in that moment. And for the first time in a long time, there wasn't just fear in her chest. There was a flicker of light. Lena sat still for a long moment, mud clinging to her sleeves, knees pressed into soaked grass, and breath coming in uneven bursts. The rain no longer felt cold. Her mind, once filled with frantic calculations and instinctive terror, was suddenly silent, because what she'd heard hadn't come from the storm. It had come from him. Elliot, her son, her silent boy who hadn't spoken in over a year, not a single word since the fire that had stolen his father and scorched their lives to ash had cried out. Not for himself, not out of fear, but for the dog. He'd seen something slipping away, and he had broken his silence to save it. Lena turned to him, hands still trembling. "Elliot," she whispered. He looked up at her, mud on his cheeks, hair plastered to his forehead. There was no fear in his eyes, only urgency, only the echo of something older than words. He opened his mouth, hesitant at first. "She's hurt," he said, voice fragile but real. "We can't let her fall." Lena felt the words like thunder in her ribs, and then she knelt and pulled him close, pressing his soaked jacket to her chest. "You came back to me," she murmured, voice cracking. "I didn't know if I'd ever hear you again." Elliot didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just hugged her back. When they pulled apart, they turned as one to the dog still lying just beyond the well curled in pain, her body twitching, breathing shallow. Blood trickled from her hind legs, dark against tan fur. The labor had started. She didn't cry out. German shepherds rarely did, but her eyes were half-lidded with exhaustion. Her strength, so solid earlier, was beginning to wane. "She won't make it like this," Lena said. "We need a better system, stronger support." Elliot was already moving. He darted toward the trees, scanning the underbrush with that sharp, searching look he always had as a toddler before the silence. He came back dragging a strip of torn blue tarp. Lena's eyes widened. "From the old fencing," she realized. Elliot nodded. "It's strong." They found more pieces buried under branches, half covered in moss. Lena wound the tarp into thick cords, then tied them around the existing vines with tighter reinforced knots. When Elliot pointed to a snapped bungee strap from an old tire swing behind the clearing, she added that too. It wasn't pretty, but it was stronger. The kind of cradle you'd bet on in a storm. They worked in rhythm now, no longer driven by panic, but by purpose. Each pull of tarp, each knot tied, each moment of silence shared, it was healing something deeper than either of them could explain. Lena glanced at Elliot as they double-checked the reinforced harness. "You were amazing," she said quietly, "not just because you spoke, but because you chose to." Elliot ran a hand along the damp bungee cord. "She was brave first," he replied. And Lena realized then his voice wasn't the only thing that had returned. His heart had never left. They turned to the second dog again. Her breathing had slowed, but her eyes tracked them. She hadn't given up. She was waiting. "Ready?" Lena asked, more a ritual than a question. Elliot nodded. She looked down into the well once more, heart racing, hand steady. "We're coming," Lena whispered. "And this time, nothing snapping." The storm had quieted to a whisper, but the cold was worse now. Not sharp, but deep. The kind of cold that seeps into bones, turning muscle into lead and breath into smoke. Rain still fell, though thinner now, like the last trembling notes of a fading symphony. Lena stood at the well's edge, rope coiled around her forearms, every movement a silent prayer. Elliot stood beside her, steady, not because he wasn't scared, but because the fear no longer ruled him. He looked into the darkness, to the barely visible outline of the second dog, still nestled in the makeshift cradle of tarp, bungee cord, and Elliot's own jacket. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms. Blood streaked one of her hind legs. Her belly pulsed in erratic contractions. Time was closing in on all of them. "We lift now," Lena said. Elliot nodded. His small hands gripped the rope just beneath hers. They heaved. The cradle jerked upward with a creak, taut and heavier than before. The weight wasn't just the dog. It was gravity, soaked rope, blood, the ache in Lena's shoulders, the storm's leftover breath. And still, they pulled. The dog didn't move. She didn't flinch. But her head tilted slightly, her eyes searching upward through the dark and rain. She knew. They were trying, again. "Don't stop," Lena muttered through clenched teeth. They didn't. Foot by foot, the cradle rose. It scraped the wall once, twisted slightly, but held. Midway up, the dog's back legs slipped from the fold, dangling limp. She let out a strained whine, but didn't struggle. She seemed to understand that fighting now would break the whole thing apart. Elliot saw the blood trailing down her leg and gasped. "She's still hurting." "She's close," Lena said, voice thin. "We just have to get her up. Just a little more." Her arms shook, her legs burned, her soaked hair clung to her face like roots, and still pull. Rain slid down the rope in streams. A knot near the top began to stretch. "Please, no," Lena whispered. "Not now." Elliot saw it too. He stepped forward, pressed his body weight down on the counter side of the rope, adjusting the angle, redistributing tension, as if he instinctively understood the balance. The knot held. The cradle rose again. And then, like an exhale, the dog's paw crested the edge of the well. Lena dropped to her knees, arms screaming, and grabbed the edge of the cradle. With one last pull, she dragged the limp, bleeding shepherd onto the earth. The moment her body touched solid ground, Lena collapsed beside her. Her hands hovered, unsure where to touch. The dog's eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed again. "Still breathing," Lena whispered. "Still fighting," Elliot added. He knelt beside her. She was shaking now, her body spasming in waves. The contractions had grown more frequent and sharper. "She's going to have them," Lena said, eyes wide. "Right here." "No," Elliot murmured, slipping off his rain jacket. "She's going to have them warm." Gently, he laid the jacket across her body, then crawled beside her, curling his small arms around her neck. The shepherd's breath was shallow, but her eyes opened just long enough to meet Elliot's. And in that quiet, frozen clearing beneath trees heavy with water and sky full of fading storm, she thumped her tail. Once. Lena knelt back, arms wrapped around herself, heart thudding. They had done it. 2 lives pulled from darkness. 2 mothers saved. She looked over at Elliot, who was now curled gently against the second dog, face nestled against her thick fur. And for the first time in over a year, he smiled. Not because the world was fixed, not because the pain had vanished, but because something was healing, right here, right now. And it had started with a whisper in the dark, and a hand that didn't let go. The sky was losing its color. The last streaks of daylight had slipped behind the treetops, leaving only the charcoal outlines of branches swaying in the wind. The forest had gone quiet again, but not with peace, more like something holding its breath. Thunder rumbled low and long in the distance, like a warning too tired to shout. Lena stood over the injured shepherd, her eyes darting between the dog's blood-streaked hind leg and Elliot's pale, determined face. The rain hadn't stopped, only softened now, a steady whisper brushing the leaves. "We can't stay here," Lena said, mostly to herself. "She won't survive the night like this, not on wet ground." She tried to think through the cold, think through the weight of what they'd done. Somewhere in her memory, beneath years of dust and distance, a name flickered. "Mr. Vance," she whispered. Elliot looked up. "There's a cabin," she said. "An old hunting cabin. Past the North Bend. Used to belong to a man named Arthur Vance. Nobody's touched it in years, but it had a stove, a cot, firewood." Elliot didn't ask questions. He only stood and began gathering the tarp. They fashioned a stretcher from what they had tarp, 2 long fallen branches, and vines tied at the ends. Lena tested the weight. It would hold, but barely. The shepherd was heavy, but not in a way that frightened her, in a way that mattered. "Easy," she murmured as they rolled the dog gently into place. The other dog, Ember, limped close behind, her head low, but her eyes sharp, protective. As they started walking, Lena took the front end of the makeshift stretcher, Elliot the back. They didn't speak, conserving breath and balance. Every step sunk slightly into wet leaves and loam. Their boots squelched through soft earth, the darkness thickening around them like a closing fist. The wind picked up. Thunder cracked, louder this time. They were racing the storm again. Lena's shoulders burned. The stretcher dipped slightly to the left, and the injured dog whimpered. But still they moved, past the old pine split by lightning, past the dry creek bed now rushing with runoff, past the half-rotted signpost where the trail used to be. Ember limped alongside Elliot, refusing to be left behind. Occasionally she nudged his elbow like a silent metronome, keeping him in rhythm. The trail narrowed. Trees leaned in. And just as Lena's legs began to buckle from exhaustion, she saw it. A sliver of roof, a chimney like a jagged tooth rising out of brush. The cabin. Old, squat, and blanketed in moss, it looked like something grown, not built. But the door was still there, hinged and intact. They reached the porch. Lena handed off her end of the stretcher, staggered to the door, and knelt beside the baseboard. She remembered. Mr. Vance had always kept a spare key tucked under the corner rock in a rusted tobacco tin. Her fingers fumbled in the wet moss. There. The tin was still there, and inside, miraculously dry, was the key. She unlocked the door with a click that sounded louder than thunder. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but it was shelter. It was hope. "Inside," she breathed. Together, they carried the injured dog in, laying her carefully on a frayed wool blanket beside the cold hearth. Ember followed and curled up beside her, eyes never leaving Elliot. Lena lit the oil lantern with fingers that barely obeyed. The flame flickered to life, casting long shadows against the log walls. They had made it, but the work was far from done. Outside, thunder roared one final time, then faded into a steady rain. Inside, for the first time in hours, there was warmth, not from fire, but from the breath of life still moving in that cabin. The door shut behind them with a heavy, weather-warped thud. Outside, the wind howled through the forest like a wounded animal. But within the cabin walls, everything fell still. Only the sound of breathing, ragged, wet, and real, echoed through the dimly lit space. Lena set the oil lantern on a crooked table and turned, scanning the cabin. The air smelled of mildew and soot, but it was dry, solid, safe. She dropped to her knees and helped Elliot pull the second wool blanket from the back wall. It was stiff with time, but usable. Together they spread it near the fireplace and layered it with an old fur coat hanging by the door. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Tonight it would be a cradle. The dogs were too weak to object. The injured one, who hadn't moved since they laid her down, rested her muzzle on her paws, eyes closed, breath shallow. Ember, the other, had curled herself around her companion protectively, but now her body had begun to tremble again. Not from the cold, from within. "She's starting," Lena said quietly. Elliot knelt down beside her, instinctive, gentle. He pressed his palm softly to Ember's side. He didn't flinch as the muscle beneath his fingers contracted. "She's scared," he whispered. Lena knelt beside him. "You're doing good," she said, unsure if she meant the words for him or the dog. They moved together now, without needing to speak. Lena rummaged through the small kitchen for anything useful. She found a dented kettle, half a roll of gauze, a bowl with a cracked rim. She filled the bowl with water from the rain barrel outside and set it beside the blanket nest. With damp cloths, she began wiping Ember's paws, cleaning the mud from her fur. Elliot stayed close, whispering softly to her. Not words always, but something deeper. A murmur from the part of him that didn't need sentences. He stroked her muzzle, and Ember leaned into it. The fire was reluctant at first. The wood was damp, the flint old, but Lena coaxed it alive. Sparks, then light. Then the room began to glow, the kind of golden flicker that pulls the world in close. Elliot's eyes reflected it. He looked like a painting, framed by firelight and faith. The first contraction hit Ember hard. She jerked, whimpered, her legs kicked weakly. Lena knelt beside her, pressing a steady hand to the dog's belly. "Easy, girl," she murmured. "You're not alone." Time folded after that. One pup, then two. Each birth a trembling miracle, wet and fragile and gasping. Lena cleaned them with cloths, helping Ember when she grew too weak. Elliot cradled them in his lap, one by one, letting them find warmth before returning them to nurse. The third pup arrived breech. For a moment, it didn't move. Lena held her breath, but Elliot reached for it, gently massaging the tiny chest with the corner of his sleeve. "Breathe," he whispered, lips close to its fur. A hiccup, then a whimper, then life. 4 puppies in total. The final one was smaller than the rest, with a splash of pale fur over its chest. As Lena toweled it dry, she paused. A perfect star, right in the center. She blinked. Elliot reached for the pup, and the moment it touched his hands, it wriggled. Its mouth opened wide in a tiny cry that rose above the fire's crackle. Ember turned her head toward them, exhausted but aware, and slowly licked Elliot's fingers. The bond was sealed. Lena looked at her son, at the dog, at the newborn pup glowing faintly in the light. and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the world didn't feel broken. It felt like the start of something new. The fire had burned down to a low, glowing cradle of embers. Outside, the storm had begun to retreat into the mountains, leaving behind only the sound of dripping leaves and the distant hush of wind shifting directions. The world held its breath. Inside the cabin, time had collapsed into a pocket of silence. Lena sat against the wall, legs folded beneath her, her sleeves soaked with birth water and ash. She was shaking, but not from the cold anymore, from awe. On the wool blanket before her, 4 newborn pups now nestled against Ember's belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling in uncertain rhythms. They were fragile things, blind, squirming, as soft as breath. Elliot knelt closest. His eyes, wide and bright, never left the 4th pup, the one he had pulled from the edge of stillness. It had been stillborn. Or so they thought. When it emerged, limp and cold, Lena's heart had dropped. She'd reached instinctively, turning it over, patting its back. But there had been nothing. No twitch, no gasp, just silence. But Elliot didn't let go. He had taken it gently into his hands, small enough to fit entirely within his palms, and whispered something Lena couldn't hear. Something that wasn't words, but was somehow understood. And then, almost impossibly, the pup had moved. A flutter, a tremble, a gasp that sounded more like a hiccup. And now it breathed, tiny, weak, but alive. Elliot sat cross-legged, the pup cradled in the crook of his arms like something sacred. It snuggled against his chest, seeking warmth. He lowered his head, resting his cheek softly against its back, his hair brushing the damp fur. That's when Lena saw it. The fur on the pup's chest was unusually pale like ash after fire, and within that patch of soft white, a distinct shape emerged. A 5-pointed star. Not a trick of the light, not a pattern from the fur around it. A perfect, symmetrical star, etched in fur, like some birthright. Lena leaned in. Elliot. But he didn't look up. He was still lost in whatever quiet connection was passing between them. Then Ember, still groggy, still recovering, lifted her head. She watched her pup for a long moment, then inched forward, nudging Elliot's wrist with her nose. He didn't flinch. Slowly, gently, Ember licked his hand. Not just once. A slow, deliberate gesture. Grateful, trusting, final. Lena's breath caught. That moment, it wasn't just about the puppy. It was a bridge between pain and healing, between silence and speech, between a boy who'd lost his voice and a creature who had nearly lost everything. They had both come back, together. Lena lowered herself beside them, folding an old blanket over Elliot's shoulders. "You did that," she whispered. Elliot looked up. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in his arms, nestled against his chest, was proof that sometimes what we save saves us back. The fire cracked softly, and outside the cabin, dawn waited just beyond the trees. The light outside was still dim, caught somewhere between night and dawn. Shadows clung to the window panes, and the fire had dwindled to a red-orange pulse in the hearth, casting soft, breathing light across the floorboards. Lena had just refolded the last of the bloodied cloths when she heard it. A sharp, guttural sound, low and strained. Not Ember. She turned quickly. The second dog, The quieter one, the one with pain folded into her stillness, was shifting. Elliot looked up from where he sat beside Ember and the sleeping pups. His brow furrowed. Ash was trying to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her as if caught between instinct and exhaustion. A soft whine escaped her throat, followed by a heaving breath. Lena moved instantly. "Easy," she said, kneeling beside the second dog. Her coat was darker, grayer around the muzzle, and her body carried an edge of wear Lena hadn't seen in Ember. This one had known hardship, discipline, orders, but beneath it there was still softness. Barely. And now there was pain. Ash let out another strained yelp, curling in on herself. Her belly tightened visibly beneath her coat. "She's going into labor," Lena whispered. She reached to check her flanks and paused. There, clipped loosely to a faded nylon collar, was a military tag. Worn. Scratched. Canine Unit. Echo. Lena's heart skipped. She turned it over in her fingers. The back read only a sequence of numbers and the faint outline of a U.S. flag. "She's from a unit," Lena murmured. Elliot was already moving toward her, the star pup still bundled in his arms. He sat down beside Ash and pressed his hand gently to her side. She was shaking now, not from cold but from strain. Lena felt the rhythm of her breath, rapid, uneven. And then came another contraction. Sharper, longer, but no pup. Something was wrong. Lena reached out and pressed carefully along Ash's belly. Too firm. The bulge of a puppy but not aligned. "She's not pushing," she said aloud, almost thinking through her words. Then Elliot said it, softly but with certainty. "The baby is sideways." Lena turned to him. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering something he shouldn't know, something he couldn't possibly have been taught. "Ash showed you?" she asked. He didn't answer, but his eyes said yes. Lena took a breath, closed her eyes. When she was young, maybe 12, her grandfather's shepherd had a troubled birth. She remembered the calloused feel of his hands guiding hers, the moment the pup had shifted inside the womb, the feel of instinct paired with faith. She hadn't thought about that day in years. Now, it was the only thing she could hold on to. "I need you to keep her calm," Lena told Elliot. "I need her to trust me." Elliot nodded and knelt beside Ash, placing one small hand over her heart, the other still cradling the star pup in his lap. He leaned close to her ear, whispering things no one else could hear. Lena took another breath and reached in. Ash jerked, but did not snap. Her eyes rolled wide with fear, but locked onto Elliot's. The pup was indeed sideways stuck. Slowly, gently, Lena turned it, felt it shift beneath her fingers. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, little one." A long moment. Then, with a final groan and push, the pup slipped free. Still. Limp. No sound. Lena wrapped it in a cloth and began to rub, gently but quickly. Elliot reached forward and touched its head. As if in answer, the pup twitched, then cried. A long, thin, defiant cry. Ash collapsed back against the blanket, chest rising and falling with effort. But when she turned her head and saw her pup, she nudged it close with her nose, letting it find its place against her warmth. Lena exhaled for the first time in minutes. "And Elliot?" He smiled again. Not because the crisis was over, but because life had won. Again. The storm had passed, but its breath still lingered on the windows in foggy patterns, ghosts of wind and water, pressed against the old cabin glass. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, wet fur, and something older earth and birth and blood. Lena had washed her hands in a basin of cold water warmed by firelight. She moved with quiet urgency now, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair sticking to her neck. Beside her, Ash lay sprawled across the patchwork blanket, muscles twitching with each contraction. The first pup suckled quietly nearby, its tiny paws kneading against fur not yet dry. Another spasm racked Ash's body. Lena steadied her. "She's not done," Lena murmured. "I can feel more." Ember stirred from her corner, watching, alert but calm, as if she understood her sister in pain. Elliot was curled beside her, the star pup pressed against his chest. He hadn't slept, but his eyes never left Ash. Lena knelt again. Her fingers worked gently, guided by memory more than sight. She remembered being 13, watching calves struggle to rotate inside a panicked cow. The vet hadn't made it in time. Her grandfather had shown her how to shift the shoulders, just so how to breathe for the creature when it couldn't. That was years ago, but the instinct had stayed. She placed her hand gently over Ash's belly, then another at the opening, slowly guiding the next pup with each surge. The movement was awkward, the angle difficult. Sweat beaded along her forehead. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just a little more." A final push, and then a new pup emerged, mottled gray and black, silent. Lena's chest tightened. Again? She cleared the pup's airway with shaking fingers and rubbed its chest firmly, just as she had with the first litter. But nothing. She rubbed harder. Still nothing. "Elliot," she said without thinking, "I need you." The boy was already beside her. He didn't ask what to do. He didn't flinch at the sight of the limp body. He reached down, placed both hands on the pup's chest, and closed his eyes. It was quiet for a beat. Then, a shudder beneath his palms, a wheeze, and then a cry. The pup coughed once and wriggled, kicking weakly as it squirmed into life. Lena nearly fell backward from the wave of emotion that surged through her. "How?" she breathed, eyes on her son. But Elliot only smiled faintly. "She wasn't ready to leave yet," he said softly. They cleaned the pup together and tucked it beside its sibling. And the births continued, each one less complicated than the last. 3 more from Ash, small, vibrant, alive. By the time the last contraction passed and Ash collapsed in quiet relief, the total was 8 puppies, 4 from Ember, 4 from Ash, a perfect, impossible symmetry. Lena sank back against the cabin wall, watching as the 2 mothers curled around their litters, fur against fur, heartbeat against heartbeat. She'd never seen anything so quietly beautiful. Elliot leaned his head against her shoulder. "They're safe now," he whispered. She looked down at him, touched his cheek gently. "So are you." Outside, the trees dripped with the last breath of the storm, but inside, life had bloomed again. The fire had dwindled to soft embers. Lena sat in silence, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of 2 exhausted canine mothers curled around 8 sleeping pups. The room was still, filled with only the faint crackle of wood and the occasional sleepy whimper from the nest of warmth on the cabin floor. Elliot had fallen quiet too, but not from fatigue. He was watching, not with a child's wonder, but with something more ancient, focused, listening. His hand rested gently on the star-marked pup, Nova, who now lay nestled between the others, as if born with an instinct to lead despite his size. Lena leaned her head against the cabin wall. The adrenaline of the night was beginning to burn off, leaving behind a fragile shell of exhaustion. She closed her eyes just for a second, and then Elliot whispered, "They ran away." Lena's eyes fluttered open. He hadn't moved from his spot. He was still cradling Nova, voice barely audible over the hiss of burning logs. They were somewhere. Cold. White. Like a hospital. But not. Lena sat upright. "Elliot?" He didn't look at her. His gaze was far away. "They did bad tests. One of them cried. A lot. The others stayed quiet and watched. But they hurt them. They made them fight. They made them scared." Lena's skin prickled. "Who told you that?" she asked softly. He finally looked up. But his answer wasn't direct. "They didn't want their babies to be taken." Lena knelt beside him. "Sweetheart, who's they?" He reached out and touched Ember's side, then Ash's. The two dogs, though half asleep, stirred under his touch, as if his fingertips echoed something more than contact, as if they remembered him from a time that didn't exist. Lena's voice trembled. "Are you saying they told you this?" He nodded slowly. Lena looked toward the tag still clipped to Ash's collar. K9 Unit, Echo. "Mind-link trials," she muttered. "I read an article once. Classified research. Neural syncing with canines, but it was just a theory." She looked back at her son. "It was never just a theory, was it?" Elliot pressed his forehead gently against Nova's tiny head. "I can feel it," he whispered. "When they're scared. When they miss someone. It's not words. Just feelings. Pictures." Lena's breath caught. "What do you see now?" Elliot's brow furrowed. They were kept in a place with steel walls and people in white coats. But one day, someone opened the cages. One of the men wasn't like the others. He helped them run. He paused, then added almost brokenly, "They thought the woods would be safe, but then they got chased." Lena's heart dropped. Everything, the military tags, the condition of the dogs, the precise way they protected their unborn made sickening sense now. These weren't strays, they were fugitives. Mothers escaping something engineered, something controlled, something that would come looking. Elliot's voice dropped to a whisper. "We can't let them take the puppies." Lena touched his cheek. "No, we won't." They sat in silence again, the truth lingering in the air, heavier than thunderclouds. And in the cradle of the firelight, Nova lifted his head, tiny, fragile, and stared straight into Lena's eyes. She didn't know how, but she felt it too. He understood. The morning arrived like a held breath finally exhaled. A gray mist curled through the pine trees, softening the harshness of dawn and cloaking the forest in a veil of stillness. The old cabin, tucked in the shadow of two leaning oaks, stood silent, its roof steaming faintly as the moisture of last night's storm met the first warmth of sun. Inside, the fire had died down, but warmth lingered. The mothers Ember and Ash dozed with their newborns nestled at their bellies. A peaceful chaos of tiny paws, twitching tails, and sleep-suckling pups unfolded across the blanket. Elliot was tracing the edge of Nova's star-shaped birthmark with a fingertip, whispering something only the pup seemed to understand. Lena had just poured hot water into a chipped mug when the knock came. 3 raps, too measured to be friendly, too early to be neighborly. She froze. Another knock, louder this time. Ember's ears pricked. Ash rose with a soft growl in her throat. Lena exchanged a glance with Elliot. She moved to the door, cracked it an inch. A man stood there, tall, clean-cut and dry despite the muddy trail behind him. His uniform was a deep slate color, unmarked by insignia, except for a small silver triangle pinned near the collarbone. He didn't smile. "Morning," he said, voice even and rehearsed. "Lieutenant Harrow, Defense Division." Lena didn't open the door further. "Defense of what?" He smirked faintly, as if expecting resistance. "I'm tracking 2 canines. Escaped assets from a controlled government facility, both females. One possibly in labor." Lena's throat tightened. "I haven't seen any dogs," she lied, voice calm but clipped. He tilted his head, eyes scanning past her shoulder. "This cabin belongs to a Mr. Vance, doesn't it? Used to hunt up here." Lena didn't answer. Harrow took a slow breath. "Look, ma'am, I'm not here to arrest you or your child. We're just trying to retrieve what doesn't belong out here." Elliot appeared behind Lena, clutching the edge of her sweater. His eyes went straight to the man, unblinking, measuring. "Cute kid," Harrow said offhandedly. "Looks like he's seen a few winters already." Lena felt the heat in her neck rise. "Can't help you," she said. Harrow nodded slowly as if conceding something he wasn't ready to. "Mind if I step inside just to make sure?" Lena's hand tightened on the doorknob. "I do mind." He stepped forward. That's when Ash growled, loud, low, dangerous. And then Ember joined her, rising from her spot despite her exhaustion, body planted firmly in front of the blanket where the pups slept. The growl echoed in the wood-paneled walls. From behind a hill of crates, Nova poked his tiny head out, ears perked, gaze fixed on the intruder. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped his throat. Something in that sound made Harrow hesitate. His eyes narrowed. Lena stepped fully into the doorway now, blocking his view. "We're not a kennel, and you have no warrant." He didn't blink. "These aren't normal dogs, ma'am." "No," she said. "They're family." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the distant crunch of tires over gravel cut through the tension another vehicle approaching. Harrow looked over his shoulder, jaw tightening. "Tell you what," he said coldly. "We'll be back with paperwork." He stepped back, tipped his head once, and turned away. As he walked toward the trail, Lena noticed it for the first time. On the back of his neck, just beneath the collar, was a tattoo. 3 rings, interlocking, not military. Something deeper, something buried. When she shut the door, her hands were shaking. Ember sat beside her, still tense. Ash returned to the pups. And Elliot? He only said one thing. He knows about Nova. The silence after Harrow left was deceptive. Lena stood frozen by the door, heart thudding in her chest like a second storm. Ash hadn't sat down. Ember was still pacing head low, flanks rising with every heavy breath. The pups stirred softly, unaware of how close danger had come. And Elliot? He hadn't moved. He stood in the corner of the cabin, one hand gently cradling Nova, the other tucked behind his back as if guarding something. Lena turned to him. "He'll be back." Elliot didn't speak, but his eyes flicked toward the small wooden crate near the fireplace. Lena followed his gaze. Inside were a few of the old toys Mr. Vance used to keep for visiting grandkids' balls, whistles, and a ragged, dirt-smudged plush fox with a squeaker in its belly. Elliot pulled it out and gave it a quick squeeze. Eek. The sound was unmistakably similar to a puppy's cry. Lena blinked. "That's—" Elliot nodded once, then looked at her with an expression that was no longer just a child's. There was strategy there, a quiet defiance. He offered the toy in his open palm. A plan was forming, and he was already ahead of her. The door rattled. Another knock. Harder this time. Lena opened it cautiously. Harrow had returned. Alone, this time his expression had shifted. Less patience, less performance. "I'd like to look around," he said without waiting. Lena forced a smile. "Still no dogs, Lieutenant." He frowned. "You sure?" Elliot stepped forward before Lena could speak, holding out the fox toy. "They squeaked last night," he said softly. "Mom said it kept her up." The toy was nestled between his palms like something sacred. Harrow raised an eyebrow. "Squeaked?" Elliot nodded. Then, without breaking eye contact, he squeezed the toy. Eek! It bounced off the wooden walls, shrill, high-pitched, puppy-like. A perfect imitation. Ash let out a soft growl from behind the crates, but Lena quickly coughed, loud and exaggerated, covering it with a step forward. "See?" she said lightly. "Just an old toy. We're not hiding anything." But Harrow didn't back down. He leaned in slightly. "Then you won't mind if I step inside for a look." Lena tensed. "Actually, I do. You're on private land without a warrant." His eyes narrowed. "Lady, we're not playing games." Crunch. The sudden grind of tires outside silenced them both. Harrow turned his head toward the window. A beat-up maroon Subaru was pulling up the path, its headlights still on, windshield wipers squeaking across glass. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a woman in a mud-splattered coat, stethoscope around her neck, and a vet's ID badge still clipped to her front pocket. Dr. Mira Thompson, the local vet, and Lena's oldest friend. Her boots crunched across the gravel as she called out without hesitation, "Lena, you left a message about a goat with possible birthing issues?" Lena blinked, then caught the thread. "Yes, in the back." Mira walked straight up to the porch, barely sparing Harrow a glance. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Harrow," he replied stiffly. "Defense Division. I was just speaking with—" "Defense Division?" Mira cut him off, unimpressed. "Unless you've got a USDA enforcement badge or a state warrant for livestock inspection, you're out of your lane, Lieutenant." He stiffened. "I'm investigating missing federal property." Mira snorted. "Then go check a warehouse. This is veterinary territory. Pregnant animals, legal documentation pending." She turned to Lena. "Where's the goat?" "In the back," Lena said, voice tighter than she meant. Harrow looked between the two women, trying to gauge whether this was an elaborate ruse or just country chaos. After a pause, he adjusted his coat. "You haven't heard the last of this," he said finally. Mira didn't flinch. "Good. I'll alert the sheriff myself." He turned sharply and strode off toward the path, muttering something into the radio clipped to his collar. Only after the sound of his boots disappeared did Lena exhale. Mira waited a moment longer, then said under her breath, "Tell me everything. Now." Lena didn't answer immediately. She turned to Elliot, who was now cradling the toy against Nova's side. It squeaked once faintly, and for the first time in days, Ember and Ash lay down completely. Not in fear, but in trust. The rumble of Harrow's SUV faded into the trees like the tail of a storm that had promised worse. Mira stood on the porch a few seconds longer, arms crossed over her chest, chin raised, not moving, until the sound was truly gone. Only then did her shoulders lower slightly, though her jaw was still tight. Inside, Lena was already checking on the dogs. Ash's breathing was quick, but steady. Her eyes followed Lena with quiet vigilance. Ember rested her muzzle on Elliot's knee, seemingly calmer since Mira's arrival. The pups remained huddled together like embers in a hearth, warm, fragile, alive. Mira stepped in, shaking the rain off her coat. "He's not local," she said. "No badge number, no official documents, but he's military or close to it. Private sector, maybe. A defense division with no defined jurisdiction." Lena looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll be back." Mira nodded grimly. "And next time with a search order or 2 more men." Lena sat beside Elliot and Nova. "He said they belonged to the government, that they escaped." Mira crouched and opened the vet bag she had slung over her shoulder. She began pulling out supplies, antiseptic, gauze, a small packet of protein gel. "Not surprised," she said. "I've been hearing rumors for years. Neurological implants, behavioral syncing, dogs trained not just to obey, but to feel on command. But they never made it public. Too unstable. Too many failures." She didn't say what happened to the failures, but Lena could guess. Elliot was unusually still. His fingers toyed with the tag on Ash's collar. "K9 Unit. Echo." "You really think they experimented on them?" Lena asked. Mira answered without looking up. "I think they created something they couldn't control. And now they want it back." She turned to Lena and added, voice sharp but not unkind, "But I gave him a warning shot." "What did you say?" "That any further intrusion without a court-approved inspection warrant would qualify as harassment under state agricultural protection laws." I cited clause numbers. He blinked. Lena gave a short laugh, one that cracked in the middle. "Will it hold?" Mira hesitated. "No, not long, but long enough." She glanced at the pups. "Long enough for them to grow stronger. Long enough for you to decide what comes next." Elliot looked up from where he sat, cross-legged, Nova curled in his lap. "We need to move them." Both women turned. Mira studied the boy a moment, then nodded. "Yes, we do." Lena swallowed hard. "You have somewhere?" Mira stood. "My brother. Off-grid place past the southern ridge. We used it as a wildlife triage center before funding got cut. He's been rebuilding it as a retreat. No cell towers, no satellite visibility, just old roads and pine." Lena glanced at the dogs, then the door. "They'll come with more," she whispered. "I know," Mira said. A moment of silence passed between them. Then Mira added, voice firmer, "But this time, we won't be bluffing. This time, we'll be ready." Lena nodded. Outside, the wind shifted. Pine trees creaked. But inside the cabin, the fire held, and so did the bluff. For now. The rain had stopped by morning, but the world outside the cabin still felt soaked in tension. Fog hugged the tree trunks like secrets refusing to lift, and the damp earth muffled every footstep, every breath. Inside, the air was heavier than smoke, not from fear, but from decision. Lena stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the forest pulse in low light. The dogs were resting, though not sleeping. Ash's eyes flicked open at every creak in the wood. Ember nosed her pups every few minutes as if counting them. Nova had curled beside Elliot on a makeshift mattress. The boy's fingers were woven into the puppy's fur, his chest rising and falling with quiet trust. It had become their rhythm heart to heartbeat. Mira broke the silence. "We move them tonight?" Lena turned. "You're sure?" "As sure as I am that Harrow will be back," Mira said. "But next time, he won't knock." She spread out a faded topographical map on the dining table, the corners curling from years of disuse. Her finger traced a path from their current location to a thick patch of green far beyond the main road. "This is the cabin. My brother Lucas built it after leaving his ranger job. Off-grid, solar-powered rain collection. He uses it for wildlife rehab and winter tracking. Anyone else know about it?" Mira looked up. "Just me. And now you." Lena swallowed. "And it's safe?" "As safe as we're going to get." She leaned over and unfolded a second sheet of paper, this one a sketch of an old horse trailer with a penciled-in note that read, "False wall paneling complete." "I finished converting the back end 2 years ago. It has a compartment big enough for both mothers and their litters, insulated, ventilated. From the outside, it just looks like feed storage. You've planned for this." "I've planned for worse," Mira said simply. Together they began to prepare. The dogs were alert, but compliant. Mira moved calmly, confidently, vet hands practiced in the balance between urgency and reassurance. She wrapped the pups in thick towels one by one and placed them in a lined crate. Elliot helped, whispering soft names as he lifted each tiny body, names like Leaf, Coal, and Flicker. When it was time for the mothers, Lena guided Ember gently. Ash hesitated at first, growling softly until Elliot reached out and pressed his forehead to hers. "They're taking us where no one can hurt you." The words came out barely audible, but Ash followed him. By dusk, the trailer was packed. The hidden compartment was surprisingly spacious. Soft straw lined the bottom, and Mira had installed a vent system that could be opened manually once they cleared the last checkpoint. The outer walls smelled faintly of cedar and rust, enough to mask any scent from eager dogs or curious agents. Lena stood back, breathing hard. "Once we go," she said, "there's no coming back, is there?" Mira didn't sugarcoat it. "No, there isn't." They stood in silence, the forest pressing in. Then Elliot walked over and slipped his small hand into Lena's. "I'm not afraid," he said. She looked down, startled by the calm in his voice. Neither was Nova curled by his feet, tail thudding gently. That was enough. Mira stepped into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the trailer rumbled to life. The bluff had bought them time. Now came the escape. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where signal faded and maps grew uncertain, a new chapter waited. One they hadn't written yet, but one they were ready to survive. Together. The trailer moved like a whisper through the morning fog, its wheels crunching over gravel roads forgotten by most maps. Every bump felt like a held breath. Every turn, a test of fate. Inside the cab, Mira drove with quiet resolve, her fingers tight around the steering wheel. Her vet scrubs were smudged with ash and fur, lending her the weary authenticity of someone who'd been through long nights and emergencies. Beside her, Lena sat in silence, the map folded neatly in her lap, though both of them knew the route by memory now. The back of the trailer was dim, insulated from the world. The dogs lay quiet in the false compartment, tucked behind the stack of empty feed bags and equipment crates. The puppies were bundled together beneath a warm fleece, soft noses twitching in sleep. Ember and Ash stirred now and then, as if sensing the shifting air, and in the narrow crawl space just above them, Elliot crouched, watching, listening. Nova rested beneath his arm, alert but still, as if the puppy understood the stakes better than a creature his size should. The first checkpoint came just after the old ranger trail, a crude barrier of cinder blocks and a portable scanner. Two uniformed men stood in front, rifles slung but unsnapped. One wore mirrored sunglasses, even in the overcast gloom. Mira rolled down her window slowly. "Morning," she offered, casual. "Just doing a relocation. 3 injured wildcats from a fire zone near Cranebrook." The guard with the sunglasses peered into the trailer. "You a vet?" "Certified. Rural Division. Want to see the badge?" He nodded. Mira handed over her laminated ID. It looked real because it was only the region had been altered slightly with smudged ink and an aged sticker, enough to pass if no one dug too deep. The man passed the ID back without another word. "You get checked down the line. Big mess up north. Something about biotags and missing trackers." He waved them through. Mira drove on, but her hands didn't loosen. 2 more checkpoints came in rapid succession. One waved them past after a glance in the rearview mirror. The second had dogs, but not trained scent ones. Civilian security, nervous and chatty. Then came the final checkpoint before the forest deepened. It was different, less makeshift, more official. A man in black stepped up. His uniform bore no name, only a patch that read Division 3. The eyes behind the glasses were colder, scanning not just the trailer, but the faces inside it. "Open the back," he ordered. Mira hesitated, her smile forced. "I'd prefer not to disturb the—" The man cut her off. "We've had reports of stolen assets. Dogs, modified, dangerous." Lena tensed. Inside the trailer, Elliot looked at Nova, then at the thin line of light beneath the hatch. He didn't ask for permission. He pushed the hatch open from the inside, revealing himself to the man outside before Mira or Lena could react. The guard startled. His hand drifted toward his holster. Elliot stood there, arms protectively curved in front of Nova and the sleeping bundles behind him. His voice came out steady, not loud, but full. "They're mine," he said. The forest seemed to hush. Ash and ember stirred at once, rising behind him with slow, powerful grace. They flanked the boy like sentinels, shoulders squared, heads low, not snarling, not threatening, but unmistakable in their message. This boy was not alone. The guard froze. Elliot looked at him, not with fear, but with something older, something rooted. "They're mine," he repeated, "and they're not dangerous." The man's fingers twitched near his radio. Then he paused. Maybe it was the child's calm, or the dog's unblinking loyalty, or maybe it was something deeper, some sliver of instinct that warned him, "This is not your story to interrupt." He lowered his hand. Mira exhaled through her teeth. "Everything okay, officer?" she asked. The man stared a moment longer, then nodded once. "Just stay on the main road." And like that, they were moving again. Inside the cab, Mira was pale. "Did you teach him that?" she asked. Lena shook her head, watching her son through the side mirror as he slid back into the compartment and gently closed the hatch. "No," she said softly. "That was all him." Behind them, the checkpoint shrank into the mist, and ahead, the forest opened like a waiting hand. The truck could go no farther. The trail had narrowed into little more than a deer path, swallowed by undergrowth and draped in fog. Mira parked beneath the outstretched arms of a birch tree, its branches shivering in the wind. From here on, They would walk. Lena shouldered a pack filled with blankets, medical wraps, and the few supplies they could carry. Mira hoisted a crate of emergency rations, her frame smaller than Lena's but driven by a quiet determination. The dogs walked beside them, padding soundlessly across the damp ground. Their coats were slick from the fog, their eyes alert. Elliot, though, carried only one thing. Wrapped in his arms like something ancient and sacred was the star-marked pup, Nova. Its head rested beneath his chin, tiny breaths fogging against the boy's neck. The rest of the litter had been tucked safely into a modified duffel bag lined with towels and nestled between Ember and Ash. But Nova? Nova stayed with Elliot. He hadn't let go since the last checkpoint. The path wound deeper into the woods, cutting across half-frozen creeks and low, mossy ridges. Above them, the canopy shifted in long, slow exhales, like the forest itself was watching. The group walked in single file, boots sinking into old pine needles, silence their only language. And then Elliot spoke. "He's showing me things," the boy murmured. More to the air than to anyone. Lena, a few steps ahead, stopped mid-step. Mira turned, eyebrows raised. Neither woman interrupted. Elliot lowered his eyes to Nova, his fingers curled protectively around the pup's belly. I don't think it's like dreams," he said softly. "It's like memories, but not mine." His voice didn't carry wonder. It carried weight. He's scared. Not just because of what happened, but because they saw everything inside. Lena crouched down to his level. "Sweetheart, who saw what?" "The white coat people," Elliot replied. "The ones with the lights and the cold voices. They didn't want Nova born. They didn't want any of them born." The wind shifted through the trees. Mira stepped closer, more curious now than alarmed. "Elliot," she said gently, "can you tell what they did?" The boy nodded, eyes never leaving the pup. "They put something inside, not in a bad way, but deep, like a spark that can talk, like a piece of thought." "An implant?" Mira whispered. "But how would a pup—" Elliot blinked. "He doesn't think with words. He just shows me. Images, feelings, like Ember in a dark room with loud noises and men yelling numbers, or Ash, screaming even though she wasn't making any sound." Lena felt her hands go cold. The boy looked up. "Nova remembers, even though he wasn't born yet. He remembers through them." It struck Lena then, not just what Elliot was saying, but how he was saying it. Not like a child playing pretend, not like a boy just coming out of silence. He was translating from a place language could never reach. Nova whimpered softly, then nuzzled tighter into Elliot's arms. And Elliot said one more thing. "They didn't run away just to live," he murmured. "They ran so their babies could be free, so they could remember something pure, before someone made them forget who they were." The forest stood still. Not a single leaf moved. Mira wiped at her eyes without realizing. "I've heard rumors," she said, voice tight. "Projects to increase neural bandwidth in canines, implants, signal tracking, emotional mimicry. They said it never worked, too unpredictable. But what if—" Lena stood slowly, gaze heavy. "What if it did?" No one answered. They walked on, deeper into the unknown. But Elliot's arms never loosened, and Nova, the star-shaped shimmer on his chest pulsing ever so faintly, did not sleep. Because some things, some connections, are older than fear and stronger than any cage. The cabin was little more than a shadow at first, an outline pressed into the mist like a memory not yet remembered. Tucked deep within the folds of the forest, surrounded by towering firs and thick brush, Mira's brother's hideaway revealed itself slowly, cautiously, like the forest itself had to approve their arrival before offering shelter. Lena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since they left the last road. A sloped roof sagged under years of moss and pine needles, and the wooden porch tilted slightly to the left, worn by time and storms. But it stood. More importantly, it waited. No wires, no antennas, no line of sight from any satellite path Mira had mentioned. Just trees. Just silence. They'd made it. Elliot was the first to approach the door, Nova still curled in his arms. The boy didn't knock. Instead, he pressed his forehead gently against the wood, as if listening. Then he whispered, "It's safe here," before turning the knob. Inside, the scent of cedar and old smoke filled their lungs. Dust motes danced in shafts of light leaking through slatted shutters. A stone hearth dominated one corner, and a faded leather couch stood like an old sentinel facing a shuttered window. There was no electricity, no hum of appliances, just stillness. They began the process of settling in. Blankets were unrolled. The puppies were gently transferred from the crate to a makeshift nest near the fire. Lena lined the area with Mira's old flannel shirts, their familiar scent grounding something inside her. Ember limped toward the pile and lay beside her pups, nose nudging each one, counting. Ash took longer. She circled twice, then collapsed near the doorway, her body still tense, ears flicking at every creak. Her eyes followed every movement. It would take time. Mira unpacked antiseptic, gauze, and a small kit of veterinary supplies. "They'll heal," she murmured as she knelt by Ember. "Not just the wounds we see." Elliot sat quietly nearby, cross-legged on the floor. Nova was now nestled among his siblings, but Elliot kept a hand on the pup's back steady, grounding. He didn't speak, but his presence pulsed with something Lena couldn't name. Not innocence, not trauma, something between. She watched as he gently untangled a twig from one pup's fur, whispering nothing, just breathing beside them. The boy who once screamed in his sleep now carried a calm that felt older than him. Mira returned from checking the perimeter, voice low. "No tracks, no movement. We'll stay hidden for now, but we need to assume we're being hunted." Lena nodded, rubbing her temples. "How long before they find this place? If Harrow's unit is serious, days, maybe less. Depends on how much they're willing to spend to get them back." "Not just dogs," Lena muttered. "Property." Mira paused, eyes hardening. "No. Proof." She looked toward Elliot. "He's not just a witness. He's a mirror. And Nova? He's the key." Outside, the wind stirred the pines. Inside, the fire began to grow. As the night folded in around them, Ember shifted and curled her body tighter around her pups. Ash finally rose and limped across the floor, laying down with her back to the door. Guarding, watching. Lena tucked a blanket over Elliot as he drifted off beside the hearth, his hand never once leaving Nova's side. They were safe for now, but the woods weren't just shelter anymore. They were the last defense for something bigger than any of them. The cabin had settled into a hush, the kind only deep woods could summon. Outside, wind combed through the pines like a mother through a restless child's hair. Inside, the hearth crackled with lazy embers. Shadows danced against the old log walls, curling and folding around the figures huddled in the living room. Elliot sat cross-legged on the braided rug, cradling Nova in his lap. The pup was small, softer than the others, his fur a rich dusk brown that faded into a pale cream belly. But it was the mark etched clean and symmetrical over his chest that caught the eye, a five-pointed star, sharp as if drawn with intention. It shimmered, not brightly, not with the artificial sheen of a glow stick or the flicker of a dying fire, but softly, organically, a pulsing, gentle light that seemed to echo Elliot's breath. When the boy leaned in, the glow grew bolder. When he blinked or turned, it dimmed. The connection wasn't imagined, it was living. Sarah watched from across the room, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Her eyes hadn't left them since the pup had been born, but tonight something changed. The air felt charged, intentional. Elliot looked up. His voice, though quiet, cut clean through the stillness. "He can talk to anyone," he whispered. "Not just me." Sarah froze. Her breath caught in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked gently, crossing the floor to kneel beside him. Elliot didn't flinch. He stroked Nova's ear with 2 fingers, then looked up at her, not like a child searching for approval, but like a boy who knew something he couldn't unknow. "He showed me the forest. Before we even walked through it, the trees, the way the wind would blow. He told me Ember was scared, but Ash was angry. He said he remembers where they came from." He pressed his palm to Nova's chest. The light beneath his hand pulsed once. "It's not words. It's pictures. Feelings. Like when you dream, but you're awake." Sarah turned sharply to Mira, who had been standing by the corner table, scribbling notes by lamplight. "Mira?" The vet approached, kneeling down beside them. Her gaze dropped to the pup, then to Elliot. "You said it glows," she murmured. "Can I?" Elliot nodded and gently lifted Nova to her. Mira turned the pup in her hands with the delicacy of someone handling a priceless relic. She leaned in, narrowing her eyes, then pulled a small pen light from her coat and flicked it on. The beam landed on the star. No reflection, just a faint iridescent subdermal. It wasn't on the surface of the skin. It was inside. "That's not a birthmark," she said, her voice hollow. "It's an implant." Sarah's breath hitched. "A what?" Mira shook her head slowly. "I heard rumors. Years ago. Quiet ones. DARPA-level quiet. Neural bridge implants in canines. The idea was to give handlers direct intuitive connection, more than commands, more than scent cues, a shared field of perception. But it was experimental, illegal in many countries, dangerous, especially for the young. She touched the mark. Nova stirred but didn't flinch. "I didn't think they succeeded," she whispered. Or maybe they did, and buried it. Elliot tilted his head, watching her. "He's not a machine," the boy said firmly. "He's alive." Mira met his gaze. "I know. He chose me." Sarah looked between them. Elliot, Nova, Mira, and felt the weight of something ancient press against her spine. This wasn't just an escape. This wasn't even just a rescue. This was a revelation, a pup born from a mother who had fled men in white coats, bearing a star in his chest and visions in his mind. A child once silenced by grief, now able to speak with a creature born from the very system that broke him. They were mirrors of one another, wounds stitched together by something neither science nor spirit could fully explain. The fire popped once behind them. Nova opened his eyes, wide and gold and glowing, and looked directly at Sarah. And in that moment, she felt it. Not a thought, not a word, just warmth, just trust, just the unmistakable echo of something watching back. The night deepened around the cabin like a heavy quilt. Wind pressed against the window panes, whispering secrets only old forests knew. Inside, the fire had mellowed to a quiet glow, casting long, slow shadows across the wooden floor. Everyone was still except the flames. Elliot sat on the floor with Nova curled in his lap, the pup already asleep, chest gently rising and falling. His star-shaped mark no longer glowed, but somehow its presence still filled the room. Sarah sat beside Mira at the table now cleared of supplies. The quiet had grown weighty, like it was waiting for something to be said. Mira broke it first, her voice low and haunted. "They were meant to be weapons," she said. Sarah blinked. "You mean the mothers?" Mira nodded. "Not just them, the whole unit." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a faded envelope. It was worn soft at the edges, smudged by time and handling. She laid it flat on the table and opened it with care. Inside were 3 photographs, grainy, black and white clearly, taken without permission. The first showed a row of German shepherds in metal harnesses, their eyes dull, muzzles covered in strange wires. The second, a close-up of a handler in full tactical gear, standing beside a dog with a scar along its skull, exactly where Nova's star mark now glowed. The third, a lab. Not just sterile, but clinical in a way that stripped dignity. Dogs behind glass, some pregnant, some shaved for surgery. Notes on whiteboard scrawled with terms like neural echo receptors and emotional mapping bridge. Sarah covered her mouth. Jesus. They were testing cortical implants, Mira continued, her voice tight. They didn't just want loyal dogs. They wanted dogs that felt what their handlers felt, knew things before they were spoken, faster than voice, faster than gesture, pure response. She tapped the photo. But that meant violating the most sacred boundary, autonomy, thought. Lena, who had remained silent at the door with arms folded, finally spoke. "But Ash and Ember, they escaped," Mira nodded. "Yes, and heavily pregnant. My guess is the implants passed through to one or more of the pups. Nova confirms it." Across the room, Elliot stirred. He looked up, not sleepy, but alert, watching, absorbing, like he already knew what Mira was going to say next. "They didn't want to hurt anyone," he said softly. "They just wanted their babies safe." The room fell into stillness again. It wasn't just a child's voice. It was a truth, pure, undeniable. The way he said it, quiet, sure, like a witness stilled Mira's breath. Sarah met his eyes. "Did he show you that?" Elliot nodded. "A hallway, bright lights, screaming dogs, needles. Ash ran first. Ember followed. They broke a glass door to get out. One man tried to stop them. She knocked him down, but she didn't bite. She just ran." Mira closed her eyes, emotion cresting. "That matches a classified memo I saw once. Facility breach, 2 canines missing, pregnant, tagged as hostile due to sensitive neural load." Sarah gripped the edge of the table. "So they're hunting them, not because they escaped, but because of what's inside them." Mira whispered, "And now, inside their children." Outside, a branch snapped in the wind. Lena instinctively looked toward the window, hand brushing the curtain aside. Darkness, but the weight of the truth remained. These aren't just dogs anymore, Sarah said slowly. They're living evidence of illegal experiments, of sentient design, of things the public would never accept. Mira nodded. They can't let them live, not freely, not without control. Elliot gently hugged Nova closer. He doesn't want to hurt anyone, the boy said, voice barely a whisper. He just wants to be. The pup stirred and sighed as if echoing agreement. Sarah looked at Mira, then at Lena. This wasn't a rescue, was it? Not really. No, Mira said. It was an escape. One they planned the moment they broke the glass. And now, it was an inheritance. The responsibility had shifted from the lab to the mothers, to a boy who hadn't spoken in a year, and to the pup born with a star on his chest. Not weapons, messengers. The morning mist clung low to the ground, curling through the pines like ghost breath. Inside the cabin, Lena stirred tea, Mira studied a map, Sarah checked the pups, and Elliot sat with Nova in his lap, silent, listening. Then they all heard it. A metallic whine, building. A drone. A sleek black triangle circling once, then vanishing behind the trees. They found us, Mira whispered. Sarah tensed. We have to go. Mira nodded. North Ridge. 4 miles. Beyond that raw forest. No roads, no signals. Elliot stood. We can make it. Lena met his gaze. He was steady, transformed. Then we move. Now. Mira mapped the route. Sarah packed supplies. Elliot soothed the pups. Ember growled, low not fear, readiness. They worked fast, the air thick with urgency. But as they prepared, Mira's plan became clear. I'll stay, stall them, give you time. No, Lena protested. You have to go. This isn't just escape, it's a story they can't understand. A boy who found his voice, a pack that chose to protect, not obey. Elliot hugged Mira. Tell them we're not giving him back. I'll tell them, she whispered. Outside, the sky lightened, but the wind carried warning. They left, Lena, Elliot, the pups, the mothers, into the wilderness. Mira stood in the cabin doorway, a silent goodbye forged from purpose. The forest breathed around them. Crickets hummed, trees groaned in the wind. Ember and ash led, sure-footed. Elliot followed, clutching the crate of pups, listening more than watching. He didn't ask questions. He wasn't afraid. Lena kept close, heart pounding. But each time doubt tried to root her in place, she saw Elliot calm, connected. At Forks he paused, glanced at the dogs, and somehow knew. They told me, he said softly, when she asked how he chose. They climbed higher. The trees thinned. Stars spilled across the sky. The pup stirred, then settled when Elliot touched the crate. They know we're running, he said. They're waiting. A branch snapped behind them. Lena froze. Only a deer. But every sound now felt like a signal. Still they pressed on, deeper into the untamed dark. Ash slowed, chuffing softly. Ember circled back. Elliot knelt, whispering to the pups. Ash pressed her head to his back. No commands, no words, but perfect understanding. They reached the ridge in the hour before dawn. Beyond it lay shadowed valleys, untouched by signal or map. A faint hum, distant but closing, shivered the air behind them. We're not just hiding, Elliot said. We're becoming. And Lena believed him. Because this wasn't escape anymore. It was transformation. And the pack ran on. They reached the canyon just before nightfall, where the world dropped away like a sigh and the trees gave way to cliffs that time forgot. No trails, no signs, no echoes of men, just stone, wind, and the hush of a place too wild to be owned. Lena stumbled on a root as they descended into the hollow, but Ash caught her weight with a nudge of her flank. Ember trotted ahead, tail up, sniffing for danger that didn't come, and Elliot, tired but steady, walked as though this had always been the destination, not an escape, a return. At the base of the canyon they found a small alcove of rock and root, half hidden by hanging moss and curling vines. Shelter of sorts, just enough to keep the worst of the wind off. Lena spread the old tarp. Elliot set down the crate of puppies, whispering as he did, "They're okay. They're tired, like us." Each pup blinked slowly, noses twitching, little sighs rising from warm bellies. Ash circled the area once, then lay down at the entrance like a watchful sentry. Ember pressed against the inner wall, curling protectively near the crate. Nova, the one with the star on his chest, was the last to settle. He crawled from the crate, wobbling on tiny legs, and nestled himself right against Elliot's ribs. The boy didn't flinch. He simply lay back, one arm cradling the pup like a living heartbeat. The stars blinked awake overhead. Cold light touched the canyon walls, painting the stone in silver and violet. Somewhere far off an owl called once. Then silence returned. Lena sat on a rock just beyond the tarp, knees pulled to her chest, watching her son. Elliot didn't speak. He didn't need to. Nova shifted slightly, his muzzle pressed into the boy's shirt. A faint shimmer flickered across the pup's fur, so faint it could have been a trick of the firelight. But Lena had seen it before. Nova was more than a dog. He was a key, a bridge, a message still unfolding. Elliot stroked the pup's back in slow, steady lines. He wasn't petting him like a toy. It was something older, reverent, a ritual between two creatures that somehow understood more than words could ever say. Lena blinked fast as tears built behind her eyes. Not from fear, not from grief, but from something she hadn't dared hope for in months. Peace. Elliot whispered something then, barely louder than the wind. "He feels everything." Lena leaned forward. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The boy didn't look away from Nova. "Not just me. Not just the others. He feels the trees, the rocks, the fear people leave behind when they run." Lena's chest tightened. "And what does he feel in you?" A pause. Then Elliot whispered, "He feels... I don't want to be afraid anymore." That broke her. The tears came, hot and sharp, tracing clean lines down her dirt-smudged cheeks. She crawled forward, pulled him into her arms, careful not to disturb the pup. Elliot didn't cry. He simply rested his head against her shoulder, breathing in sync with Nova between them. For a long while they said nothing. They didn't need to. Above them, the sky stretched wide and infinite. Below, in that forgotten canyon, a mother, her son, and a wounded pack found something that didn't need a name. Not safety, not freedom. Something deeper, like truth, like home. The wind shifted just after midnight. It wasn't the cold that stirred Lena from her half-sleep. It was silence. A silence too perfect. The kind that didn't belong in a living forest. She sat up slowly, the tarp crinkling beneath her. Ash was already standing at the alcove's mouth, ears rigid, eyes fixed on the tree line. Beside her, Ember let out a low growl that sounded more like thunder beneath breath. Lena moved to Elliot, shaking him gently. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "wake up, quietly." Elliot's eyes opened without fear, as if he'd already known. He gathered Nova into his arms, cradling the pup close. The others in the crate stirred, sensing something in the air. And then, a flicker of red between the branches. Laser sights, movement, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. "They found us," Lena breathed. She didn't wait to be brave. She moved. The pack followed as if one body dog's boy, mother. They sprinted through the rock-lined corridor behind the alcove, one Lena had only guessed might exist. The terrain dipped sharply, uneven with moss-covered roots and icy stones. Branches clawed at their arms and faces, but they didn't stop. From behind, a voice rang out, filtered through a comm device. "Visual confirmed. Package in motion. Do not engage the child." Flashlights sliced the dark. Drones buzzed overhead. Elliot tripped, but Ember was there, nudging him back up. Ash circled back once, teeth bared, before vanishing into the dark like a ghost. A crack split the air, then another. Not bullets, trees. The forest responded. As if some ancient alliance had been called upon, branches snapped behind them, roots split the earth, and one of the agent's shouts was swallowed by the sound of him tumbling into a ravine masked by leaves. The canyon was not empty. It was watching. It was protecting. Lena turned to look once, just once, and locked eyes with the man standing atop the ridge. Lieutenant Harrow. No rifle, no pursuit, just him, still like stone among trees. The dogs bristled but didn't bark. Elliot, panting, clutched Nova tighter and whispered, not to his mother, not to the agents, but to Harrow. "He doesn't belong to you." Harrow didn't answer. He didn't order the team forward. He didn't raise his weapon. He just watched. And in the hush between chase and choice, his face hardened by protocol, scarred by something long ago shifted, subtle. But it was there. Doubt. Another crack echoed, more branches falling. By the time the retrieval unit cleared the ridge, there was nothing but canyon. Empty, silent, gone. Deep in the forest's lung, Lena collapsed behind a ring of brambles. Elliot was unhurt, the dogs, trembling but uninjured. Nova licked Elliot's chin, tail flicking once. Lena looked at her son, his cheeks flushed, hair matted with dirt, and asked, "You okay?" Elliot didn't answer with words. He just reached out and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart, then on Nova's. And for a second Lena felt something pass between them, not fear, not adrenaline, but purpose, as if the forest had seen fit to remind them they were no longer running, they were surviving together. The sky was barely breathing light. A thin veil of mist clung to the ridge, softening the edges of the world into something dreamlike. Lena sat in the hush before sunrise, arms around her knees, the chill of dawn crawling under her jacket. But her eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on the boy, just a few feet ahead. Elliot sat cross-legged on a smooth rock, Nova nestled between his knees. The pup's ears twitched, his tiny chest rising in time with Elliot's own breath. The rest of the pack lay curled behind them, Ash and Ember keeping a tired watch, their bodies forming a protective crescent around the sleeping litter. For the first time in days, no one was chasing them. The silence was not empty now. It was earned. A soft glow spilled over the ridge line, golden and hesitant, like the earth itself was unsure whether it was safe to begin a new day. Elliot reached forward and gently touched the star-shaped patch on Nova's chest. The fur shimmered faintly in the light, as if catching a reflection no one else could see. Then, in a voice both fragile and clear, Elliot said, "He's not a weapon." Lena lifted her head. "He's a message," Elliot whispered. "They wanted to make him something that obeys. But he listens. He remembers. He knows." Lena rose, walking the few steps to crouch beside him. "And what do you think the message is?" she asked softly. Elliot looked up at her, eyes still wide and innocent, but steadier now. Older, somehow. "That we don't have to be what they made us to be," he said. "That we can choose." Lena nodded, her throat tight. "Then we protect that message," she whispered, brushing the boy's hair from his brow. "With everything." They sat in silence as the sun crested over the mountains. Light spilled across the valley below, untamed, untouched, and free. Trees rustled with the wind of a world that had existed long before humans thought they could cage it. And somewhere in that symphony of nature, Lena heard something ancient in the hush. Not all stories end with escape. Some begin with it. She took Elliot's hand in hers. He stood. Nova followed, tail wagging slightly, already instinctively walking at Elliot's side. Behind them the others stirred, stiff but ready. Together they began to walk along the ridgeline. Not away, not fleeing, forward, toward whatever waited beyond this wilderness, toward a future they had no map for, but one they now had the courage to shape. The mother, the boy, the dogs who were never just dogs, and the pup who bore the star of a new kind of hope. In a world that often forgets the quiet strength of compassion, stories like this remind us of what truly matters. That bravery doesn't always roar sometimes. It comes in the form of a boy who speaks for the first time in a year to save a life. Or in the unwavering eyes of a mother dog who refuses to abandon her unborn pups. German shepherds have long stood as symbols of loyalty, intelligence, and courage. But beyond their instincts lies something even deeper. The capacity to heal, to connect, and to protect not just bodies, but hearts. This story is not just about rescue. It's about redemption, about choosing empathy over fear, about how even the smallest voices, like a child's whisper or a newborn pup's heartbeat, can carry the loudest truths. May we all be reminded that home isn't just a place. It's the feeling of being seen, being safe, and being loved unconditionally. So if this story moved you, hold your animals a little closer tonight. Speak up for those without a voice, and never underestimate the power of love, especially the kind that walks on four legs, with eyes that remember and hearts that never give up.